It started like any other weekend camping trip. 4 friends, me, Jake, Emily, and Lucas, decided to head into the wilds of northern Michigan for a few days of hiking, fishing, and enjoying the beauty of the wilderness. We'd all been hiking before, and we were well prepared. It was the kind of adventure that seemed exciting, like the stories we told each other around campfires when we were younger, but none of us knew what we were really getting into when we stepped foot on that cursed trail. The first sign that something was off came the moment we arrived at the trailhead. There was a strange, unnerving stillness in the air. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their thick branches weaving into a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. It was early morning, yet the shadows seemed longer than they should have been. None of us spoke about it, but we all noticed the way the air felt heavy, as if the forest was watching us. We'd read up on the area before deciding to go. The trail was known for its solitude and beauty, but there were rumors. The kind of rumors you brush off as local legend. The locals spoke of things in the woods, strange creatures that lurked out of sight, things that didn't quite belong. It was just folklore, we told ourselves. Ready to get lost in the woods, Jake, ever the optimist, asked with a grin as he threw his backpack over his shoulder. "Definitely," I replied, trying to hide my unease with a smile. We started walking down the narrow, dirt path, our boots crunching against the dry leaves and twigs. The forest around us was dense, the trees growing close together, their trunks wide and gnarled. A fog began to roll in, thick and gray, curling around the base of the trees, making it feel like we had stepped into another world. It was the kind of fog that clung to everything, refusing to lift, and it made the forest feel even more claustrophobic. By midday, we'd reached a small clearing. The air had gotten cooler, and the fog seemed to thicken even more. Lucas, the joker of the group, had wandered a little ahead of us and was now standing at the edge of the clearing, staring into the trees beyond. "You guys have to see this," he said, his voice sounding oddly serious. We all approached him, my curiosity piqued. He was pointing to something on the ground, a set of tracks. "What is it?" Emily asked, kneeling down next to the prints. They were large, unlike anything I had ever seen before. The tracks were wide, shaped like an animal's paw, but they were too big to belong to any known creature, and the shape of the claws was all wrong. There was a sense of eeriness to the prints, like they had been deliberately placed to make us uneasy. "Must be a bear," Jake said, though his voice didn't sound as confident as usual. "Probably a really big one." But Lucas wasn't convinced. "No way, look at the shape. Bears don't leave tracks like this." We all stood around the prints for a few moments, none of us able to explain them. Finally, Emily stood up and dusted off her knees. "Well, it's probably nothing, let's keep moving." But none of us felt like continuing. The sight of those tracks had put a strange tension in the air. It wasn't the kind of fear you could easily shake off. Something was wrong, but no one wanted to be the first to say it. We continued on, though our steps became a little slower, and the laughter that had accompanied our walk earlier had faded into silence. As the sun began to set, we realized we had ventured deeper into the forest than we originally intended. Our campsite was supposed to be just a few more miles down the trail, but the path had become less distinct as we went along. Trees grew closer together, blocking out the light entirely, leaving us to rely on our flashlights. It felt like the forest was closing in on us, and with each step, the silence around us grew thicker. Then, without warning, Lucas stopped dead in his tracks. We all followed his gaze, but saw nothing. "What is it?" I whispered. "Something's following us," he said, his voice tight. We waited, listening to the soft rustling of leaves. For a long moment, it felt like the forest had gone completely still. No wind, no animal sounds, nothing. Then, a distant snap of a branch echoed from somewhere deeper in the woods. "Probably just a deer," Jake said, trying to dismiss the unease growing in all of us. But the snap was followed by another, closer this time. And then another, closer, closer. Suddenly, the unmistakable sound of heavy breathing echoed from somewhere behind us. It was low, guttural, almost like a growl. We all froze. My heart pounded in my chest as my eyes darted around the darkening forest. "Run," Emily whispered. It wasn't even a suggestion, it was a command, and the fear in her voice made it impossible to ignore. Without waiting for another word, we turned and began to sprint back down the trail. The sound of heavy footsteps, unnatural and quick, followed us, growing louder with each passing second. We ran for what felt like hours, but we couldn't outrun it. Whatever it was gaining on us. We could hear it now, its breathing, the heavy thud of something massive pounding the earth. But when we looked back, there was nothing, just trees. But the feeling of being hunted, of something far too close to us, never left. The forest blurred around us, the shapes of trees and shadows warping in the pale light of our flashlights as we sprinted down the narrowing trail. The sound of heavy footfalls echoed from behind us, unnatural, relentless, like something far too large, too powerful to be a normal animal. Each breath felt jagged, each footstep hitting the ground with a thud that vibrated through my body. "Go faster," Jake shouted, his voice strained as he reached for my arm and yanked me forward. His eyes were wide, his face pale in the glow of his flashlight. I could barely think, my mind focused solely on putting as much distance between us and whatever was stalking us. Behind me, the breathing was growing louder, deeper, and more labored, like something was chasing us, something that wasn't human. "We have to find somewhere to hide," Emily yelled, panic creeping into her voice. She was at the back of the group, her face twisted in fear, her breath shallow and quick. "Keep running, don't stop," Lucas screamed, his eyes wide with terror. He was leading the pack now, darting around trees and over branches, his movements frantic. Suddenly, the ground beneath me shifted. My foot caught on something, some unseen root or rock, and I was thrown forward, crashing to the dirt with a painful thud. My flashlight flew from my hand, spinning through the air and landing several feet away, its beam bouncing erratically across the dark forest floor. I gasped for air, my heart thudding in my chest. For a split second, I thought I might not get up, but then, through the haze of pain and panic, I heard it. A growl, deep and guttural. It came from somewhere behind me, close, too close. I scrambled to my feet, my legs shaking, and dove for the flashlight. The beam flickered for a moment before it settled on a distant tree. Through the darkness, I saw movement. A figure, impossibly large, standing just beyond the light's reach. Its shape was distorted, almost human, but not quite. Its head was too high, too angular, its arms too long, its eyes glowing yellow, reflecting the light like a predator's. The growl grew louder, closer. I didn't wait to see if it was going to attack. I didn't need to. "Go, now," I screamed, my voice raw. I didn't wait for anyone to respond. I ran, my feet pounding the ground in frantic desperation, but it wasn't enough. The air behind me shifted, and I knew it had started running too. The sound of its claws scraping against the dirt echoed through the trees. A shriek of pain split the air. Emily's scream. I turned, my heart almost stopping in my chest. I saw her just behind me, her face contorted in terror as she stumbled, falling to the ground. Something was coming for her. The creature, it was too fast, too strong. "Emily," I shouted, but she didn't respond. She was struggling, crawling, trying to get back up, but her hands slipped on the dirt. Then, a blur of movement, a massive, shadowy shape lunged forward. It was the creature, its long claws extended, its mouth wide with sharp teeth glinting in the flashlight's beam. I didn't hesitate. I couldn't. "Emily," I screamed again, running back toward her. But by the time I reached her, the creature had already dragged her away, its long arms wrapped around her, pulling her into the darkness, the sound of her screams muffled as it disappeared into the trees. My body froze, my heart pounded so hard in my chest I thought it might burst. "She's gone," Jake gasped, his face pale with disbelief as he caught up with me. We can't help her." "No," I yelled, my voice breaking. "We have to go after her." But Jake grabbed my arm, pulling me back. "It's too late. It's too dangerous. We need to get out of here, now." I turned, looking into the darkness, fighting the urge to run after her, but I knew deep down that it was hopeless. Whatever that thing was, it was too powerful, too terrifying, and we were not prepared for this. "Lucas." I looked around, realizing with sudden horror that Lucas wasn't there. He was supposed to be right beside us. "Lucas," I called, my voice shaking. No answer. There was nothing but the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, carrying with it the faintest trace of something wrong. "Where the hell is Lucas?" Jake demanded, his eyes wild with panic. "Shit," I muttered under my breath. I grabbed Jake's arm and pulled him forward. "We need to move. We can't stay here." Without another word, we turned and started running again. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, the trees thinning, the path winding in unnatural loops like it was trying to keep us lost. Every snap of a twig, every rustling leaf made me jump. Every shadow felt like a threat. And then, through the dim light, I saw him, Lucas. He was standing just ahead, barely visible in the shadows. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror, and his body was trembling. "Lucas," Jake shouted, rushing forward. But Lucas didn't respond. He just stood there, frozen. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. There was something wrong with the way he was standing. He wasn't looking at us, but instead staring into the dark woods behind us, his eyes wide, his mouth agape as if he were seeing something that no one else could. "Lucas," I called again, my voice low. "What's wrong?" Suddenly, his body jerked, his arms flailing as if something was pulling him, dragging him backward. Before I could react, he screamed, a horrible, blood-curdling scream that echoed through the trees. And then he was gone, vanished, just like Emily. The air went dead silent. Jake and I stood there, frozen in horror, unable to speak. Neither of us moved. The terror settled over us like a thick, suffocating blanket. "We have to run," Jake whispered. We can't stay here." But where could we go? The forest seemed endless, the shadows closing in on us, pressing us in from all sides. We were trapped. There was no way out. And then we heard it again. The growl, closer this time. We turned to run. The sound of our footsteps was drowned by the deafening silence of the woods around us. Each time we thought we heard something, a snap of a twig, the rustling of leaves, it was followed by the chilling, unnatural growl. Closer this time, almost as if the creature was toying with us, playing with its food. Jake and I were running side by side now, our breaths ragged, the cold air burning our lungs. But the trail had become a blur, the trees too close, their branches reaching down like skeletal hands. We had no idea which direction to go anymore. The world around us had collapsed into a maze of shifting shadows. Then, as we rounded a bend in the trail, I saw it. A pair of eyes, glowing yellow and wide, watching us from the darkness. The eyes were too high, too far above the ground to belong to any regular animal. They were watching us with an eerie, predatory focus. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt the world shift beneath my feet. I froze. Jake, too, stopped, his eyes locked onto the glowing orbs ahead. "Did you see that?" he whispered, his voice shaking. Before I could respond, the eyes blinked. And in that moment, I knew it wasn't just some wild animal. This was something else, something ancient, something built for hunting. With a sudden surge of terror, I grabbed Jake's arm and yanked him forward. "We have to keep moving, now," I shouted, my voice breaking as the animal, no, the thing, shifted in the shadows. I could hear its movement now, too, a low, deep growl rising from the forest floor. Jake didn't argue. We ran, our feet pounding the ground as the trees blurred around us. I could hear it behind us now, its breath heavy, uneven, like a predator enjoying the chase. The next few minutes felt like a nightmare, a blur of frantic movement, twisted roots and scraping branches. Every step we took felt like we were running out of time. I glanced over my shoulder for just a second, and that's when I saw it, the shape. It was massive, too massive. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely animal either. Its body was twisted and hunched, with fur matted along its spine. Its arms were unnaturally long, its claws razor sharp, and its head, oh god, its head was almost canine, but with eyes that reflected a demonic intelligence. The thing had no muzzle, just sharp, jagged teeth that seemed to grow sharper with every step it took toward us. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. I couldn't even breathe. My legs were on fire, but every ounce of my energy went into running faster, faster. But the creature was gaining. I could hear its heavy paws slapping against the ground behind us, the sound of it closing in with terrifying speed. I didn't know how much longer we could keep this up. We needed shelter. We needed somewhere to hide. My mind raced as we ran. Were there caves, hollowed out trees, any place where we might be able to make a stand? Then, in the distance, I saw it. A small structure, a shack barely visible through the trees. My heart leapt with hope. "Jake," I shouted. "There, the shack." Jake didn't need any more convincing. He pushed himself harder, his breath ragged, his body trembling with exhaustion. We ran toward the shack, but it felt like it was miles away. Each step felt slower, heavier, like the world around us was pressing down. Suddenly, I heard a screech, high-pitched, sharp, and filled with rage. It wasn't just the growl anymore. It was the unmistakable sound of something charging, and I knew deep in my bones that if we didn't make it to the shack, we were done for. The forest around us seemed to warp, twisting and bending as if trying to block our way. Branches reached out like fingers, grabbing at our clothes, our legs. I could feel the cold, damp air on my skin, like the forest itself was alive, like it was trying to suffocate us. Then I saw it. The creature. It was no longer hiding in the shadows. It was right behind us, its form silhouetted against the dim light as it came charging forward. Its long claws scraped against the ground, and its mouth stretched wide, teeth flashing in the moonlight. It was faster than anything I had ever seen. The sheer speed of it was terrifying. I could feel its breath on the back of my neck. It was so close now that I thought I could almost reach out and touch it, but then... crash. Jake and I both stumbled as we reached the shack's door. We crashed into it, throwing ourselves against it, struggling to get inside. The door gave way with a loud bang as the old, rotting wood splintered under our weight. I slammed the door shut behind us, our ragged breathing echoing in the small, dimly lit room. The shack was old, dilapidated, and smelled of damp wood and decay. There were holes in the walls, and the floor was covered in dirt and debris, but it didn't matter. We had made it inside. Jake and I stumbled backward, gasping for air, our eyes darting toward the windows. The shack wasn't much, but it was something, and right now, it was the only thing standing between us and that monster. We could hear it outside, its growls low and rumbling, as it circled the shack. The sound of its claws scraping against the door sent chills through my spine. The creature was trying to find a way in. "We're not safe here," Jake whispered, his voice shaking. "It's going to find a way in." I didn't respond. My mind was too focused on the creature outside. I pressed my back against the wall, staring at the door, waiting, listening. It was only a matter of time before it figured out how to break through. The minutes passed in tense silence, broken only by the occasional scrape of claws against the wood. But then there was a sound that made my blood run cold. The growl. It was closer. No. The shack trembled. The floorboards creaked under a heavy weight. Then the door exploded inward. The door splintered, chunks of wood flying across the room as the massive creature shoved its way through. The walls trembled with the force of its assault, and I could hear its claws scraping against the jagged wood. My body froze in terror as the beast's growl echoed, deep and rumbling, vibrating the very air around us. It was almost as if the very space between us and it had thickened, like the air was pushing back in fear. I turned to Jake, my mind racing. There was no way we could fight this thing. No way we could outrun it. We had no weapons, no plans, only the cold, suffocating knowledge that we were trapped. We backed up slowly, my legs shaking beneath me as I tried to keep my focus. But the room was too small. The shack was too decrepit. There was nowhere to hide. The creature's head with its glowing yellow eyes appeared through the gaping hole in the door. It was so large, its body filling the frame of the door, blocking out most of the light from outside. It was horrifying. Its fur was matted and dark, the skin underneath stretched taut across its monstrous form. The jaw was wide, jagged teeth gleaming with saliva. It had the face of a wolf, but its eyes, those eyes, they were full of malevolent intelligence, like something ancient and primal. It didn't just want to kill us, it wanted to enjoy it. "Jake," I whispered, my throat tight with panic. "What do we do?" Jake was breathing heavily, his face pale with terror, his eyes flicking from the creature to the windows. "We can't stay here. It'll get us. We have to get out of here, now." But there was no way out. The shack was surrounded. The windows were too small to escape through. The only way out was past the creature, and it wasn't about to let us go. Its claws scrabbled against the floor, leaving deep gouges in the wood as it pushed itself further inside. "Jake," I gasped again as the creature's nostrils flared, sniffing the air like it had caught our scent. its head tilted, studying us, its body too large to fully fit through the door. Suddenly, it lunged. The force of its movement sent me tumbling back, knocking over an old chair and slamming into the wall behind me. My head collided with the wood, and for a moment, everything went black. But the growl, the noise, the hunger, it didn't stop. I forced my eyes open, dizziness swimming through my brain. I saw Jake, who had fallen backward just a few feet away, scrambling to get to his feet. The creature had torn the door completely off its hinges, and now it was inside, its heavy breath so close I could feel it on my skin. The air smelled of rot, decay, and something far worse, like blood and death. Jake shouted something, but his voice was muffled by the sheer panic surging through me. I couldn't make sense of anything. The creature's eyes locked onto mine. The feeling that washed over me was more than fear. It was pure, unrelenting terror. This thing wasn't just hunting us. It knew us. It was drawn to us. It wasn't going to kill us quickly. It was going to make us suffer. I scrambled to my feet, but the room felt like it was closing in. The walls were pressing down on me. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to run. Without thinking, I grabbed an old rusted shovel that was leaning against the wall. My hand shook as I held it out, barely able to keep my grip on the handle. It was pitiful, pointless, but it was all I had. "Get back," I shouted, raising the shovel in front of me, as though it would protect me from the beast. But I knew it was useless. It was a feeble attempt to hold back something that could tear us apart in seconds. The creature's mouth opened wide, revealing a row of jagged teeth. It snarled, the sound scraping against my nerves like nails on a chalkboard. The air seemed to vibrate with its anger, and I could hear it growling, low and guttural, like a lion preparing to strike. Jake was on the floor, breathing hard, his eyes wild with fear as he looked for something, anything that might be useful, but it was too late. The thing was on us. It moved so quickly that I barely had time to react. One massive claw shot out and swiped at me, catching the shovel mid-swing and knocking it from my hands. My body was thrown back against the wall once more, my head slamming against the wood, sending stars dancing across my vision. My body felt numb, my limbs useless as I lay there, struggling to breathe. Jake screamed, rushing toward the creature, but the beast turned on him with frightening speed. It lashed out with one of its powerful arms, knocking Jake to the ground with a single blow. He hit the floor with a sickening thud, his body limp and unmoving. "No," I gasped, trying to get to him, but the creature's glowing eyes locked onto mine, and I froze in place. I didn't finish him off, not yet. It stood over him, watching me, savoring my fear. Its heavy breathing was deafening. The stench of its saliva filled the room, and I could hear its claws scraping against the floor as it paced slowly around us. The air felt thick, suffocating. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then, with a low, almost satisfied growl, it turned its attention to me again. I could see its teeth, its mouth stretching wider as it prepared to feast. And in that moment, I knew deep down that it was only a matter of time before it tore us apart. And then, as if on cue, I heard something. A loud crash, a thud. The shack's roof splintered, shaking under a massive impact. The creature turned with an audible snarl, distracted for a split second. I didn't wait for it to turn back. In that moment, with my heart racing and my body filled with adrenaline, I pushed myself to my feet. My vision was blurry, but I saw the door frame of the shack splintering under the pressure of something much bigger than the creature inside. And then it happened. Another creature, larger, even more massive, crashed through the roof. The roof exploded inward with a force so powerful that it seemed to rip the very sky apart. Splinters of wood flew everywhere, the walls buckling under the impact. The shack groaned in protest, and I was thrown backward, crashing into the corner. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. Through the smoke and debris, I saw it. The new creature, bigger, darker, more monstrous, was looming in the hole where the roof had once been. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen, its body broader than the one that had been circling us, its fur darker and more matted with grime. Its eyes were not just yellow, they were a burning, bloodshot red. And its mouth, it was full of teeth, but not the sharp, canine teeth of the first beast. These were jagged, broken teeth, designed to rip and tear apart. This thing was ancient, powerful, and its presence sucked the air from the room. For a second, all was still. The smaller creature, the one that had been hunting us, backed away, snarling and growling, clearly afraid of the new arrival. It was shaking, crouching low to the ground, as if it could sense that this thing was something far beyond it. The newcomer did not move for a moment. Its glowing red eyes scanned the room, sweeping over us with terrifying precision, as if assessing the situation, deciding what to do with its prey. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I just stared, my body paralyzed, every muscle frozen in place as it looked at me. Then it growled, a low rumble that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth. And suddenly, its massive form shifted. It moved forward with a terrifying speed, far faster than anything its size should have been able to manage. The shack seemed to tremble with each step it took toward us, its claws scraping against the floorboards as it approached. Behind it, the smaller creature growled again, but this time, the massive one didn't flinch. It was in charge. It was the alpha. I could see the terror in the smaller creature's eyes as it hesitated, clearly unwilling to fight the bigger one. The red-eyed monster didn't acknowledge it. It was only focused on us. Then, in a blur of motion, the creature lunged toward Jake, who was still lying on the floor, struggling to move. He tried to scream, but it was too late. The creature's jaws snapped shut with a horrifying crunch, and before I could process what was happening, Jake was gone. His body was pulled into the thing's mouth with a sickening jerk. I screamed, but the sound of my own voice felt distant, muffled by the pounding in my ears. The sheer terror that gripped me was suffocating. I was frozen. I couldn't move. I couldn't do anything. The alpha creature stopped. It paused for a moment, chewing slowly, savoring its kill. Blood dripped from its mouth, and I felt my stomach churn, bile rising in my throat. But it wasn't done. No, it wasn't done with us. The red eyes turned back to me, and then, with one swift movement, it turned to the smaller creature and, with a snarl, shoved it aside. The smaller creature whined, retreating back into the shadows, not daring to challenge the alpha. For a moment, there was silence. Only the sound of the creature's breathing, deep and labored, filled the room. I dared not move. I dared not make a sound. Then it spoke. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't a bark. It wasn't even a word. It was a deep, guttural sound, more like a command. It wanted us to run. My eyes locked onto the window. The dim light outside seemed too far, too out of reach. I had no idea if it was trying to give us a chance to escape or simply to enjoy the hunt. But I knew I couldn't stay here. If it wanted to play with us, I wouldn't give it the satisfaction of watching me cower. Run, I screamed to myself. And then, without thinking, I pushed off the wall, bolting toward the back door of the shack. I could hear the creature behind me, its steps pounding the ground with the power of a freight train. The walls shook with each of its movements, but I didn't stop. I didn't dare look back. I could hear it moving behind me, the sound of its claws digging into the wood of the shack, splintering the floorboards as it gave chase. Every breath felt like a jagged blade, each inhale and exhale more painful than the last, but I couldn't slow down. I reached the door, yanked it open, and ran outside. The cold night air slapped me across the face, but I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. The trees ahead blurred in the dim light, their twisted shapes looming over me like watching predators. I could hear the monster's growl grow louder, its breath now close enough to feel against my neck, hot and heavy. The air around me thickened, suffocating me with its presence. Then I tripped. My feet tangled in the underbrush, and I fell, my body crashing against the dirt. I scrambled to push myself up, but the sound of movement, the heavy pounding of the creature's steps, drew nearer. I couldn't outrun it. A scream broke through my throat, but I couldn't help it. I was paralyzed with fear. This was the end. The monster was going to crack. A sudden, violent sound tore through the air. The ground shook beneath me as something else crashed into the scene, a massive rumbling impact that sent the creature reeling. It was like an explosion of force. The air was filled with the sound of someone fighting, a shriek of pain, a growl of anger, and the unmistakable sound of flesh tearing. The creature, the one that had been hunting me, stumbled back, its focus shifting between the two massive figures. One of them, the red-eyed alpha, was backed into the trees, its jaw snapping furiously, its massive body contorting to defend itself. But there was something else here now. Another figure, larger, darker. And this one wasn't just standing in the shadows. It moved. It was bigger than the red-eyed alpha, even more terrifying, but it wasn't the same type of creature. This one had a different quality to it. Something about it felt ancient, powerful in a way that surpassed anything the monsters had shown me. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't alone in the forest. The forest around me was deathly still, save for the deafening sounds of struggle as the two massive creatures clashed. The ground beneath my feet trembled with each collision, and I could feel the power of their blows reverberating through my bones. My eyes darted from one to the other, trying to comprehend what was happening. The red-eyed alpha, which had moments ago been the terror of my existence, was now struggling to maintain its footing against the newcomer, the creature that had appeared seemingly out of nowhere. It was enormous, even more so than the red-eyed beast, but there was something different about it. The air itself seemed to warp around this new presence. It wasn't just strength that radiated off of it. There was something ancient, something primordial that made the trees themselves bend in respect. Its fur was dark as midnight, and its eyes, unlike the others, glowed an intense, almost ethereal silver, as if they were forged from the very light of the moon itself. Its jaw, just as brutal and deadly, was full of sharp, white teeth, but there was an elegance to it, a vicious grace that made the red-eyed monster look clumsy by comparison. I couldn't look away. The alpha creature recoiled from the newcomer, its teeth bared in a snarl, but the larger creature was undeterred. With a single, swift movement it lunged, its jaws snapping shut on the alpha's throat. The sound was sickening, a wet, crushing noise, as the alpha's body jerked violently in the grip of the newcomer's immense power. The alpha, desperate, fought back. It swung its claws, aiming for the newcomer's face, but it was too slow. The larger creature was faster. It was as if it knew exactly how to move, every strike calculated, every moment deliberate. With another savage twist of its head, the newcomer shook the alpha violently, and I heard something crack, perhaps its neck, perhaps its skull. The alpha's eyes bulged, and for the briefest of moments, I saw something I hadn't expected. Fear. It was afraid, terrified. The newcomer released its grip and the alpha collapsed to the ground, its massive form twitching in the dirt. Blood poured from the creature's throat, staining the forest floor in deep crimson. The red-eyed alpha's once ferocious growl died away, replaced by the heavy, gurgling sound of its last breaths. For a moment, the world stood still. And then, with a final, guttural roar, the red-eyed monster's body went limp. Its limbs twitched one last time before it lay still, its eyes vacant, its blood soaking the ground beneath it. I could hardly breathe. I was trembling, my heart racing in my chest as I tried to make sense of what I had just witnessed. Had I just seen the death of one of the creatures that had hunted me? And if so, what did this new arrival want with me? What was it? It stood over the fallen body of the alpha, its chest rising and falling with each powerful breath. Slowly, it turned its gaze toward me, its eyes locking with mine. I froze. The silver in its eyes glinted like 1,000 stars in the night sky. For a moment, I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The power emanating from this creature was overwhelming, but it wasn't just strength, it was intelligence. It was something more. And then it did something that shocked me. It bowed its head, not in submission, but in a gesture I could only interpret as respect. I took a step backward, still unsure whether I should run or stay. My body felt numb, my limbs heavy. My mind couldn't process what was happening. But before I could make any decision, the creature turned, its eyes glinting as it scanned the trees around us. Then, as if it had accomplished what it had come for, it stepped away from the corpse of the alpha and began to move deeper into the forest. Its steps were calculated, deliberate, each footfall echoing through the trees, and just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. I stood there, motionless, for what felt like hours, my body refusing to move as I processed the chaos that had unfolded. The forest was silent once more. The weight of the hunt had shifted. But what did that mean for me? The pain in my head and the ache in my body finally caught up with me, and I stumbled forward, my legs weak beneath me. I had to get out of here. I had to get away from this place before anything else showed up. But then, a sound broke the silence. It was a low, throaty growl, a familiar sound, one that I had heard countless times. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze in place. Slowly, I turned around, dreading what I might see. The smaller creature, the one that had been hunting us from the beginning, was still there. It had been watching the fight unfold from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to make its move. But now, with the alpha defeated, it was alone. Its eyes glinted with anger and hatred, and it stalked toward me, its body low to the ground, its claws extended. I knew what it wanted. I knew what it needed. It wanted vengeance. In a split second, the creature lunged toward me, its jaws snapping in a blur of motion. I barely had time to react. I threw myself to the side, my heart hammering in my chest, and the creature's teeth grazed the edge of my jacket, ripping a hole in the fabric. I didn't have time to think. I had to get out. I had to survive. I scrambled to my feet, running blindly through the forest, not caring about the branches that slapped at my face or the rocks that tripped me up. I just needed distance. I just needed time. I could hear it behind me, its growl echoing in the night, the sound of its pursuit like a shadow that stretched across the entire forest. My breath was ragged, my legs burning with exhaustion, but I kept going. Every instinct told me to run, to survive. I didn't know how much longer I could keep this up, but then something caught my eye. Ahead of me, the trees began to thin out. The forest opened up into a small clearing, a river. Without hesitation, I bolted toward it. I didn't know if the creature would follow me into the water, but I had to try. I had to escape. I reached the riverbank, the cold water rushing past me as I looked around for any way to cross. I could see a fallen log stretching across the water like a natural bridge. The sound of the creature's growl grew louder. It was almost upon me. I didn't hesitate. I leapt onto the log, my heart pounding in my chest as I balanced precariously over the rushing water. Behind me, I heard it, the creature's claws scraping against the rocks, its growl now frantic, desperate, but it didn't follow. It stopped. It stopped just short of the river. I turned around, panting heavily, and saw the creature standing on the other side of the bank, staring at me. Its eyes were filled with rage, but it made no move to follow. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was safe. I stood on the opposite bank of the river, panting heavily, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My heart pounded in my chest like a drum, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. The creature on the other side, its glowing yellow eyes burning into me, was watching, but not moving. It stood frozen, its form towering above the rocks and roots of the forest floor. But there was something different now. The furious growls and snapping of jaws had stopped. It was like the creature was waiting. I couldn't trust it. I knew that much. Even with the raging river between us, this wasn't over. This thing would find a way. It always did. I backed away slowly from the edge of the water, never taking my eyes off the creature. It didn't make a sound. It didn't even move. It just stood there, staring. Its chest heaved with every breath, but it wasn't rushing at me like I thought it would. No, it was patient. It was toying with me, waiting for me to make a mistake. The forest around me felt suffocating. The air had thickened with the weight of the hunt, and despite the fact that I'd gotten a brief respite, I knew I wasn't truly safe. I wasn't out of danger. The river, while an obstacle for the creature, wasn't a guarantee of safety. If it wanted to cross, it would find a way. I had no idea how far the river stretched, or if there were more creatures in the area, waiting, watching. The reality of the situation hit me with a sudden, cold clarity. I was completely alone in this forest. The only thing between me and certain death was a river that was likely just a temporary barrier. My legs were starting to feel weak beneath me. I was exhausted, dehydrated, and mentally drained. The last few days had been a blur of terror with little time for rest, food, or even a moment of peace. And now, even when I had a brief opportunity to catch my breath, it felt like the world around me was pressing in. The shadows were growing longer, and the night was closing in. That's when I heard it. A rustling sound from behind me. I whipped around, my heart lurching in my chest. For a second, I thought it might be another creature, a new predator stalking me through the woods. But when I turned, I saw nothing. Only the trees, their dark branches swaying in the cold breeze. But then there was the sound again, closer this time. A twig snapped, the unmistakable sound of something or someone moving through the underbrush. I wasn't alone. My breath hitched as the realization sank in. The creature behind me, the one across the river, wasn't the only danger. Something else was out there. Something that had been following me, watching me. I felt it deep in my gut, the cold sense of being hunted. I glanced back at the riverbank. The creature was still standing there, unmoving, but now there was something different in its eyes, a glint of something that I couldn't quite understand, a sort of knowing. It had left me for the moment, but I couldn't trust that it was finished. The sound behind me came again, closer now. I turned to face it, my mind racing as I tried to process what was happening. What else was out there? Was it another of those horrific monsters? Or was it something more human? A shadow moved among the trees, just out of my line of sight, and then, finally, I saw it. It was a figure, a man standing silently just inside the tree line. His face was obscured by the darkness, but I could make out the outline of his body. He was tall, lean, but there was something strange about the way he stood, something unnatural. The way his posture was too still, too precise, like he was a part of the forest itself, an intruder hidden in plain sight. My heart skipped a beat as I realized that this man, whoever he was not here to help. He wasn't here to save me, he was part of the nightmare. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling but defiant. My legs felt like lead and my hands were shaking, but I forced myself to stay upright. I needed answers. I needed to understand what was going on. The man didn't answer, he just stood there, motionless, watching me with eyes that gleamed with an eerie, unnatural light. His expression, if he had one, was unreadable, like a mask he wore to hide something deep and unfathomable. But then I saw it. The shape on his back. A long, twisted shape that hung from his shoulder. It was dark, nearly blending into the shadows, but the outline was unmistakable. A bow, a hunting bow, and hanging from his belt, a sheath, something larger, a knife. My blood ran cold. This man was hunting too, but he wasn't hunting like the creatures were. He wasn't hunting to kill for food. No, this man was hunting for something else. He was hunting us. The question burned in my mind, 1,000 thoughts racing in my head. Was he with them? Was he a part of the twisted pack of creatures that had been chasing me, or was he something more human? I took a step backward, but my foot caught on a loose stone, and I nearly fell into the river. I steadied myself, my heart still pounding in my chest as the man didn't move. He just watched. His gaze was so focused, so intense, that I felt the weight of it press against my chest. There was no way I could outrun him if he decided to attack. The forest was dense, but he had the bow, he had the weapons. I had nothing. "Please," I said, my voice weak, desperate. "What do you want?" For a long moment, the man said nothing. The forest around us was silent, except for the wind rustling the leaves above. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath. Finally, the man stepped forward, just one slow, deliberate movement, and then he spoke in a low, gravelly voice that seemed to echo around us. "They are real," he said, "and you've only just begun to understand what you're up against." His words hit me like a slap to the face. "What?" I gasped. "What do you mean?" He stepped closer again, his face still hidden in the shadows, but now his voice held a quiet certainty. "You thought the creatures were the worst of it, but there are far darker things in these woods than you realize, far older things." I felt a cold chill creep down my spine. My eyes flicked back to the creature across the river, still standing there, unmoving. "Are you one of them?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. "No," his voice was firm, "but I've hunted them, and I've hunted the things they serve." I swallowed hard. There were more of them. And who exactly was he? Was he a survivor like me, or something else? "I can't help you," he said, as if reading my thoughts. "Not unless you're ready to see the truth. You're in far deeper than you realize." Before I could respond, the man turned away, his silhouette disappearing into the trees as silently as he had come. I was left standing alone, the forest stretching endlessly before me. The creature was still there, across the river, watching me. But I knew one thing for sure now. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. This was about something much darker, something far more ancient, something that had been lurking in the woods long before we had ever stepped foot here. And if I wanted to make it out alive, I would need to understand exactly what I was dealing with. The man's words echoed in my mind as I stood there in the moonlit clearing, the river still roaring at my feet. "You're in far deeper than you realize." What did that mean? What was he talking about? What was I dealing with? I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I had been for days, and now, even more so. Every rustle in the trees, every snap of a branch underfoot felt like it carried a hidden meaning, as if the forest itself was alive, watching, waiting, ready to close in on me at any moment. I couldn't trust anyone, not even the mysterious man who had appeared from the shadows, offering me cryptic warnings and then vanishing into the night. He had given me no real answers, only more questions and now more danger. I had to keep moving. I couldn't stay here. With no clear path forward, I turned away from the riverbank, my eyes scanning the trees. The creature was still across the river, but it hadn't moved. It hadn't made a sound. And now I realized there was something even more terrifying about its stillness. It wasn't just waiting, it was watching me. It was calculating. It knew I was trapped. I moved quickly, my feet stumbling over the uneven ground as I pushed through the underbrush. My thoughts were jumbled. I couldn't think straight anymore. I needed to get out of this forest. I needed to find a way to survive. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. The shadows had deepened, the trees seemed to crowd in closer, and the air felt heavy, thick with a presence that had been lurking just out of sight. My heart raced, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt truly alone, more alone than I ever had before. I had no allies now, no one to help me, not the man, not the creatures, not even the forest itself. It was as if the world had turned against me. A sudden chill swept through the air, a cold gust of wind that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. And then the growl, that deep, guttural growl that I had come to fear, the one that made the ground beneath me vibrate. I froze. It was behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know that. I could feel it. The eyes were on me again, those burning, hateful eyes. I slowly, carefully reached for my knife, the one I had taken from the man's sheath. I had no illusions about how it would fare against a creature of that size and power, but I had to try. And then the growl stopped. Everything went quiet, too quiet. The silence hung in the air, thick and suffocating, and I realized with growing dread that I couldn't hear the river anymore. The wind had stopped. The forest had gone completely still. It was as if time itself had frozen. I turned slowly, my pulse hammering in my chest. And there, standing at the edge of the trees, was the creature, the one with the red eyes. Its fur was matted with blood, its breath ragged from its earlier fight, but it stood tall, watching me with that unblinking stare. I opened my mouth to shout, to warn myself that it was coming, but my voice failed me. I couldn't scream. I couldn't make a sound. And then the earth beneath me seemed to tremble. I didn't understand it at first. It was like a low vibration, almost imperceptible, but it grew stronger with every passing second. It felt like the very ground was shaking, and then I realized what it was. There were more. Dozens of them, hundreds. The creatures had come. They had surrounded me. They emerged from the shadows, stepping out from behind trees, their eyes glowing like embers in the dark. Some of them were massive, towering beasts, their twisted forms bending unnaturally, their jaws wide with hunger. Others were smaller, more agile, their eyes wild with madness. They moved in perfect synchronization, closing in on me from all sides. I stumbled backward, panic flooding my body. I turned, trying to find an escape, but there was nowhere to go. They were everywhere, filling the forest, their growls a chorus of pure malevolence. Their eyes were all locked on me, and for a fleeting moment, I could feel the weight of their collective gaze. 1,000 hungry eyes, all staring at me, watching me with unbridled hate. I had no escape, and then, from the corner of my eye, I saw the movement. The man, the one who had warned me, he was back, standing on the opposite side of the clearing, but this time, he wasn't alone. He was surrounded by a new set of figures, tall and shadowy, their faces obscured, their movements unnaturally fluid. They were watching me too, their eyes glinting with an ancient, terrible understanding. "Run," the man said, his voice cold and empty, but he didn't move. He didn't come to help. He just stood there like a spectator watching the final act of a play. A dark thought struck me then, one that I couldn't push away. He wasn't here to help. He was here to watch. and as I took a shaky step backward, the first creature lunged. Everything happened at once. The creatures swarmed me, a wave of claws and fangs faster than I could react. I tried to fight back, slashing with the knife, but it was useless. There were too many. Their claws tore into my flesh, raking through my skin with horrific speed. The pain was excruciating, blinding. And then, as I felt the first sharp bite tear through my throat, I realized something. This wasn't just a hunt. This was a sacrifice. The creatures didn't need to kill me out of hunger. No, this was part of something far more ancient. They weren't hunting for food. They were hunting for blood. And in the darkness of the forest, as the blood soaked into the earth, I finally understood what the man had meant. There were forces here older than humanity, older than time itself. Forces that cared nothing for us. We were nothing more than prey, nothing more than an offering to something darker, something that even the creatures feared. And as the darkness closed in, I felt the weight of those unseen forces press down on me as if they were waiting for me to join them in the endless void.